The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
I'm pleased to stand and give a speech on what I think is a highly symbolic piece of legislation and a piece of legislation that I think is starting to illustrate to Canadians the very clear differences in approach to governing between the government and the official opposition. Bill C-4 is a bill that purports to deal with preventing human smugglers from abusing Canada's immigration system, but in reality, it's directed almost solely at refugee claimants who arrive in Canada utilizing whatever means are at their disposal. I think it's fair to say that it reflects a style of government that reacts very quickly to exploit fear in our society, to take people's misery and to exploit it for political purposes, and to proceed with knee-jerk legislation that is not based on fact, not based on law, not based on reason, and not based on fairness. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to just go through some of the major aspects of this bill so any Canadians can see exactly what the essence of this bill really is. C-4 gives the Minister of Immigration the power to designate in his sole discretion a group of refugees as, quote, irregular arrivals, end quote. He can do that based on mere suspicion and based on the definition of a group that is not specified in the Act, but presumably means any gathering of two or more people. Designated claimants, once they receive that title, are then subject to all kinds of special rules, and I think, as we'll be able to see throughout the debate on this bill, discriminatory rules. I'll start with some of them. Once designated as an irregular arrival, designated claimants, including children, will be mandatorily detained on arrival or upon designation for up to 1 year. There will be no review by the Immigration and Refugee Board of their detention for 1 year. Release is only possible if they are found to be a refugee, if the IRB orders their release at the expiry of a year, or if the Minister decides that there are exceptional circumstances. Mandatory conditions set out in the regulations will be imposed on all designated claimants released from detention, subjecting these people to special conditions that don't apply to any other refugee claimant. Designated arrivals will have the suspension of their right to apply for permanent residency. So a designated claimant under this legislation will be prohibited from applying for permanent residency for 5 years. If the person fails to comply with any of the conditions or reporting requirements, those 5-year suspension can be extended to 6 years. Now, I might just pause and say, to show how arbitrary and ill thought out this legislation is, the 5-year ban on applying for permanent residency applies even to someone who is found to be a legitimate refugee. So someone could come here, be designated, satisfy the IRB within, say, a year or two that they're a bona fide legitimate refugee, and they are still prohibited from applying for permanent residency for 5 years. A designated person can't make a humanitarian and compassionate application or apply for a temporary resident permit for 5 years. In terms of refugee travel documents, a designated person cannot receive travel documents. This means that designated refugees can't travel outside Canada for at least 5 years after they have been accepted as a refugee. Now, of course, you take these three things together, and that means that a refugee claimant who comes here once designated, again, even if they're a legitimate, bona fide, legal refugee, will be separated from their families for at least 5 years, can't travel to see their families for at least 5 years, will be separated from their families for at least 5 years, and again, that's how Canada, under this legislation's government, purports to treat a bona fide refugee. This legislation contains retroactive provisions so that the Minister can make a retroactive designation for arrivals in Canada since March 31, 2009. Again, this is not done very commonly in Canadian legislatures or this Parliament. where we reach back in time and render illegal something that was legal at the time. But the government wants to do it in this case. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-4 is deeply unfair to refugees. It fails to honour obligations under Canadian and international law. It deprives individual cases from the independent review that justice requires. It will involve huge costs and unnecessary detention. Perhaps most pressing of all, Bill C-4 will do nothing to prevent human smuggling. This bill is unclear, it is arbitrary, it's discriminatory, and it's ineffective. More laws directed at refugees will not catch human smugglers who are overseas. Mandatory minimum sentences will not deter human smugglers who are overseas. Under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, smuggling is already punishable by life imprisonment, and mandatory minimums have been shown not to work as deterrents. Refugees know little or nothing about the laws before they arrive in the country of asylum, and even if they know, desperate fear for their lives often forces them to do whatever they must to flee persecution. We have an example. Australia recently tried a very similar regime, and they tried punishing refugees to try to deter them. It didn't work there. There's no reason to think it'll work here. Let me go through some of the major problems with this bill. Bill C-4 punishes refugees. Again, this bill has been presented as legislation targeting smugglers, but in fact most of the provisions punish not smugglers, but the refugees themselves. I've already talked about the fact that the refugees, including children, will be mandatorily detained for a year without possibility of independent review. Under Bill C-4, refugees, Mr. Speaker, will be victimized 3 times. First by their persecutors, second by their smugglers, and finally by Canada. Bill C-4 violates the Charter and our international human rights obligations, including the Convention relating to the status of refugees, that's commonly known as the Refugee Convention, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Bill C-4 is discriminatory, and it creates 2 classes of refugees, with one class, those designated based on their mode of arrival, treated worse than the other. This again is discriminatory and contrary to the Charter. Once again, the measures imposing arbitrary detention, Mr. Speaker, are not only likely to be constitutional, they have already been found to be unconstitutional. In the security certificate cases, the Supreme Court of Canada has already found that mandatory detention without review violates numerous sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Bill C-4 denies the right to equal access to justice. The bill denies designated persons the right to appeal a negative refugee decision to the Immigration and Refugee Board's Refugee Appeal Division. Mr. Speaker, an appeal is a fundamental safeguard in refugee decision-making, where a person's life and liberty may be at stake. By eliminating the opportunity to correct errors at the first level, the bill puts Canada at risk of violating its most fundamental obligation towards refugees, and that is not to send them back to persecution. I've talked about how C-4 blocks family reunification, which has been described by this government as a key objective of them. The bill deprives some refugees of the right for 5 years to apply for permanent residence and therefore reunification of their families, including their children. This is a violation of the right to family life guaranteed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Mr. Speaker, this bill also prevents consideration of the best interests of the child. This bill denies designated persons, including children, the opportunity for 5 years to make an application on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. This application is often the only avenue for consideration of best interests of the child under refugee law. Under the terms of this bill, however, children can therefore be deported from Canada without consideration of their best interests, again in violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child.